Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the stone-cold heart of a medieval castle kitchen, and I mean that literally. Picture yourself standing in a vaulted chamber, where the ceiling disappears into smoky darkness, where the air tastes like charred meat and wet stone, where your breath makes clouds even though you're 10 feet from an oven that could cremate a whole pig. Now picture trying to sleep there. Actually scratch that picture. Trying to sleep anywhere near there, because spoiler alert, you're not allowed to bed down next to the only heat source in a building designed to trap cold like a limestone refrigerator. Tonight's question sounds simple enough. How did cooks survive winters in medieval castles without freezing to death? But the answer is a twisted knot of social hierarchy, architectural cruelty, and desperate human ingenuity. These weren't the romantic chefs you see in movies sleeping in cozy chambers with goose-down pillows. These were labourers often unfree, almost always exhausted, who worked 16-hour days in front of roaring fires, then got banished to the coldest corners of the fortress to sleep. Their bodies were the battleground between thermal shock and pure stubborn survival. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this bedtime history thing connects people across time zones. Someone's eating breakfast in Tokyo, while someone else is fighting sleep in Sao Paulo, and we're all here together in a freezing medieval kitchen. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval castle kitchen was a paradox wrapped in stone. It was the hottest room in the entire fortress, and simultaneously one of the most dangerous places to seek warmth. 3 or 4 massive hearths burned constantly during operational hours, some large enough to roast an entire ox. The heat was so intense that cooks developed a tolerance bordering on the supernatural. Modern blacksmiths would recognize the phenomenon your face scorches, while your back freezes and your body stops registering temperature in any normal way. But here's what nobody tells you about medieval heating. It didn't work the way we think. Heat didn't radiate through rooms like modern central heating. It rose straight up through poorly sealed floors and disappeared into the infinite cold of the castle's upper chambers. Stone walls, often 3 to 6 feet thick, acted as thermal batteries, but they stored cold as efficiently as they stored warmth. Touch a castle wall in January even near a kitchen, and your palm would stick to the frost. The kitchen operated around the clock because medieval cooking wasn't something you could just turn off. Fires had to be maintained perpetually. Letting them die meant hours of work to restart them with flint and tinder. Bread dough required overnight rising. Meat needed slow roasting through the night. Someone had to tend the stock pots that simmered for days. This meant the kitchen never slept, even if the cooks desperately needed to. So where did they actually sleep? You'd think the answer would be right there in the kitchen, obviously. But medieval castles didn't work on obvious logic. They worked on rigid social order, fire safety paranoia, and architectural realities that prioritized defense over human comfort. The kitchen staff scullions, turnspits, assistant cooks, even some of the senior cooks were forbidden from sleeping in the kitchen proper. The reasons stacked up like cordwood drunk or exhausted workers might knock over candles vermin were attracted to sleeping bodies near food stores, and perhaps most importantly, kitchen workers were servants who didn't deserve the castle's most valuable resource, warmth. Instead, they were relegated to adjacent spaces, sculleries, storage alcoves, sometimes literally closets where they'd pile together like refugees from a shipwreck. The architectural drawings that survive from the period show these spaces as afterthoughts, squeezed into whatever gaps remained after the important rooms were planned. Your sleeping quarters might be a former arrow-slit corridor that had been walled off, or a converted coal storage room that still smelled like sulphur, or if you were particularly unlucky, a section of the undercroft where the ceiling wept condensation and rats owned the night shift. And you probably won't survive this part some nights they didn't survive. We have records admittedly sparse, because who bothers documenting the death of a scullion of kitchen workers found frozen in the morning? Not dramatic deaths, not wolves at the door situations. Just exhausted human bodies that ran out of heat during a February night, when the temperature inside the castle matched the temperature of the grave. You're standing in front of that massive kitchen hearth. Now, flames licking at a suspended cauldron, your face flushed red from the heat, and you're thinking, what any reasonable person would think, why can't I just sleep here? Why can't I drag my straw pallet 3 feet closer to this wall of fire and finally spend a winter night without my bones aching from cold? The answer's going to make you angry, because it's not just one reason. It's 7 reasons stacked on top of each other, like a bureaucratic nightmare designed by someone who never had to sleep in a freezing stone box. First, there's the fire safety issue, and okay, this one actually makes sense. Medieval castles were paranoid about fire. With good reason, one stray ember could turn a wooden-beamed kitchen into an inferno that would spread to the great hall, the chapel, the lord's chambers. Entire fortresses burned to the foundation because someone fell asleep too close to a brazier. The 1298 fire at Carlisle Castle started in the kitchen and consumed half the interior structures, so the rule was absolute: no sleeping within 10 feet of an active hearth. No exceptions, not even for the head cook who'd served the family for 30 years. But here's where it gets crueler. Even after the evening fires are banked, not extinguished, but damped down to glowing coals, you still couldn't sleep there. Why? Because heat rises, and medieval kitchen architecture was specifically designed to let it escape. Look up in a castle kitchen, and you'll see vaulted ceilings that funnel smoke and heat straight up into chimneys or ventilation shafts. The warmth you're desperately craving is being architecturally vacuumed away from you. Standing next to a banked fire in a medieval kitchen is like standing next to a space heater in an airport hangar with the doors open. Then there's the status problem, and this is where feudal hierarchy gets its claws into something as basic as thermodynamics. Kitchen workers were servants, which meant they occupied a specific rung on the social ladder above stable hands, and field labourers, but well below the chamberlain, the steward, the chaplain. Sleeping in the kitchen proper, even when it was empty of daytime activity, would signal that you had access to the castle's most valuable controlled resource fire. In medieval semiotics, proximity to heat was proximity to power. The lord's family slept in chambers with fireplaces. Knights and honoured guests got rooms with braziers. You got whatever space remained after everyone important had been accommodated. Historians still argue whether this was purely symbolic or had practical enforcement mechanisms, but contemporary household accounts suggest both. A 1344 inventory from Beaumere Castle lists sleeping stations assigned by roll and kitchen staff are explicitly noted as quartered beyond the scullery wall and without fire privilege except by special dispensation of the steward. That phrase, fire privilege, shows up repeatedly in medieval administrative documents. Warmth wasn't a human right. It was a perk you earned through status. Here's the part that'll really frustrate you. The kitchen's residual heat did warm adjacent spaces, but it did so unpredictably and inefficiently. Stone walls conducted heat at a glacial pace, literally. By the time the kitchen's warmth soaked through 18 inches of limestone to reach the scullery dormitory on the other side, it had transformed from roaring fire to slightly less hypothermic stone. You might gain 5 or 6 degrees of temperature advantage over someone sleeping in the outer bailey, but you'd still wake with frost in your hair. The ventilation situation made everything worse. Medieval builders were obsessed with keeping kitchen smoke from infiltrating the rest of the castle, understandable since nobody wants their tapestries reeking of burned mutton, so they designed elaborate vent systems with louvered openings, chimney flues, and sometimes entire ventilation towers. All that airflow meant the kitchen zone was drafty by design. Cold air rushed in through doorways and arrow slits to replace the warm air being sucked up and out. You could be standing beside a fire hot enough to singe your eyebrows while a wind strong enough to extinguish a candle hit the back of your neck. And let's talk about the doors, because this is almost comical in its cruelty. Kitchen doors were kept open during working hours for traffic flow servants, hauling water staff carrying platters to the Great Hall, scullions dumping waste. But at night they were locked and barred, not to keep people in but to keep unauthorized people out of the castle's food supplies. That meant the sleeping quarters for kitchen staff had to be accessible without passing through the locked kitchen, which typically meant they opened onto courtyards or exterior corridors. You were sleeping one stone wall away from the outside air, separated from the frozen night by nothing but limestone and prayers. Modern thermal imaging of preserved medieval castles reveals something fascinating and depressing. The warmest spot in the entire kitchen complex after midnight wasn't near the hearths at all. It was in the spaces above the kitchen where heat that rose from the fires would collect beneath the ceiling of the floor above. Guess who slept up there? Not cooks. Usually it was empty space or storage for items that needed to stay dry, or in some castles' chambers for higher-ranking household officials who absolutely understood they were sleeping above a thermal vent. The people generating the heat slept in the cold. The people who never touched a ladle slept in the warmth that rose from others' labour. There's a reason medieval workers called the kitchen the hell that freezes. You worked in inferno conditions, your face perpetually red, your hands scarred from burns, your lungs full of smoke. Then you walked 20 feet and entered a cold so profound it felt like punishment. So where do you actually go when the last pot is scrubbed and your shift finally mercifully ends? You shuffle through a low doorway, and I mean low-built for medieval heights, which averaged about 5'6", so you're ducking, even if you're not tall, into what the household accounts called the scullery dormitory. The name makes it sound almost official, almost planned. It wasn't. This was architectural leftover space, the room equivalent of, well, we have to put them somewhere. Picture a chamber, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, with the ceiling so low you can touch the beams without stretching. No windows. Windows meant vulnerability in a fortress, and nobody was wasting defensive weak points on servants' quarters. Maybe 1 or 2 arrow slits narrow as your forearm that let in slim blades of daylight and enormous quantities of cold air. The floor is packed earth or rough stone uneven enough that water pools in the low spots when condensation drips from the ceiling. And it does drip because you've got 30 or 40 human bodies breathing moisture into frigid air all night long, and that moisture has to go somewhere. It goes up, hits the cold stone ceiling, and rains back down on you while you sleep. The smell hits you first, and you'll never quite get used to it even after years. Unwashed bodies bathing was a quarterly event if you were lucky, a yearly one if you were realistic. Wet wool because everyone's wearing their day clothes, and those clothes are perpetually damp from kitchen steam and sweat. Smoke ground so deep into fabric and hair that you smell like a campfire even when you're nowhere near flame. Tallow cheap animal fat candles that give off a scent somewhere between rendering plant and rotting meat. And underneath it all the musty stone smell of a room that never ever fully dries out. But here's the thing that might surprise you: you're grateful for this room. Genuinely grateful, because the alternative is sleeping in the outer bailey with the stable hands or in one of the unheated storage towers, or God forbid being cast out entirely to find shelter in the village. At least here you've got walls on 4 sides and a door that closes. At least here you're surrounded by other human bodies, and human bodies are furnaces that burn food into heat, and in a medieval winter other people's warmth is the difference between sleep and death. The sleeping arrangements were communal by necessity and design. No private spaces, no partitions, no your corner and my corner. Instead, there were sleeping platforms, essentially wide wooden benches built against the walls, sometimes stacked 2 levels high like bunks. Each platform was lined with straw rushes compressed and matted from months or years of use. Fresh straw was a spring luxury. Winter straw was black compacted home to generations of lice and fleas, but it provided a thin layer of insulation between your body and the freezing wood. You didn't get a bed. You got a spot on the platform, usually about 2 feet of width per person, which sounds insane until you remember that sleeping shoulder to shoulder with another human meant sharing body heat. Medieval people understood thermodynamics even if they couldn't name it. Alone you'd freeze. Together packed like salted fish in a barrel you had a chance. The sleeping platforms ran along 3 walls, and in a fully staffed castle kitchen during winter, every inch was occupied. Who you slept next to mattered intensely, and there was a whole social calculus around it. Larger bodies radiated more heat a useful neighbour on a February night. Children were tucked into the middle of groups surrounded by adults, because kids lost heat faster, and everyone knew it. Old workers got similar protection when possible, though old in a medieval kitchen meant 45 if you were extraordinarily fortunate. The strongest, youngest workers often ended up on the ends of the platforms next to the walls, where the cold was worst. It wasn't kindness that put them there, it was survival arithmetic. They could take the punishment better than a 10-year-old turnspit, or a 50-year-old baker with joint pain. And here's a detail that shows up in monastery records, but was almost certainly true in secular castles too. The platforms were assigned by shift. The kitchen operated in rotation, some workers on dawn duty, others on evening, a skeleton crew through the night. That meant the sleeping platforms were never empty. They were in constant use by different bodies. You'd finish your shift, stumble into the dormitory, and claim a spot that was still warm from whoever had just vacated it to start their work. That residual heat wasn't just pleasant, it was strategic. A pre-warmed sleeping spot could mean the difference between falling asleep or shivering for hours. Historians still argue whether there was any kind of mattress situation happening, but the evidence suggests mostly no. Straw was your mattress. Your own body was your mattress. Occasionally, and this is documented in some of the wealthier households, there'd be grain sacks or flour bags that had torn or gotten damp, and these would be repurposed as thin pallets. Picture a burlap sack filled with whatever grain had gotten too weevil-infested for human consumption, stitched closed, and laid on the platform. It's maybe an inch thick, it crackles when you move, and bits of grain dust puff up into your face. But it's something between you and the wood, and you learn to be grateful for any barrier, no matter how pathetic. The ceiling beams were the only storage space anyone had, so you'd see bundles of clothing, usually just an extra tunic if you were fortunate, hanging from nails or draped over the crossbeams. Personal possessions were nearly non-existent. Maybe a wooden bowl you'd carved yourself. Maybe an extra pair of hose if you'd managed to save or steal them. Everything you owned you kept on your body or within arm's reach, because theft was constant. Not malicious, theft, survival theft. If you left your better shoes unattended, someone with frozen feet would take them. It was understood. Now let's talk about what you're actually lying on, because bed is a generous term for what amounts to agricultural waste and desperate improvisation. That straw we mentioned, It's not the golden, fresh-smelling stuff from harvest time that you might be picturing. By midwinter, you're looking at straw that's been slept on by dozens of bodies for months, compressed into a dense mat that's more felt than fibre dark brown from absorbed sweat, and God knows what else, and alive, genuinely alive, with an entire ecosystem of insects, mites, and other creatures who've made your sleeping platform their permanent residence. Fresh straw was distributed maybe twice a year if the household was well managed, once a year if it wasn't. The autumn allocation had to last through winter, and by February you were sleeping on something with the texture of damp cardboard and the smell of a stable floor. But here's the thing: that compressed, disgusting ancient straw actually worked better as insulation than fresh stuff. The air pockets had collapsed, creating a denser barrier between you and the wooden platform. It was revolting, yes, but it was functional revulsion. Some workers supplemented their straw with rushes, those long reed-like plants that grew near water and were traditionally used as floor covering throughout the castle. Rushes were slightly better than straw. In one way, they absorbed moisture more effectively, which mattered when your breath was condensing on the ceiling and dripping back onto you all night. But they were also scratchier, and they decomposed faster, turning into a kind of black vegetable sludge that had to be scraped away periodically. The really desperate workers would stuff their clothing with rushes as additional insulation, packing their tunics full of dried reeds to create air pockets that might trap a little warmth. Then there were the sacks. Oh, the beautiful, precious grain sacks. When a sack of barley or rye developed a tear or got damp and the contents spoiled, that sack became currency in the sleeping quarters. The burlap or hemp fabric was woven tight enough to block wind, and if you could claim one, you had options. Some workers wore them as extra layers, cutting holes for head and arms, transforming a sack into a crude tunic. Others used them as blankets, though blanket is stretching the definition to breaking point. We're talking about a rectangular piece of rough fabric that maybe covered your torso if you curled into a tight ball. The really clever ones, and there's evidence for this in household inventories that list spoiled goods, redistributed, would take those damaged grain sacks and restuff them with whatever they could find. Wool scraps from the tailor's waste, feathers from the poultry plucking station, though you had to pick through trash to get them. Sometimes just more straw or rushes, but contained within the sack fabric so they didn't scatter. What you'd end up with was a lumpy, inconsistent pallet, maybe 2 inches thick, that would flatten to nothing under your weight within a week. But for that week, it was luxury. Actual blankets, woven wool blankets like the nobility used, were so rare in kitchen workers' quarters that they show up specifically in household accounts when they were issued. A 1389 record from Durham Castle notes 2 worsted blankets given to kitchen staff for communal use during hard frost. 2 blankets for probably 30 people. What that meant in practice was the blankets got laid over groups of sleepers, covering maybe 6 or 8 people at a time. You weren't sleeping under a blanket, you were sleeping under a fraction of a blanket, and whether you got any coverage depended on your position in the huddle and whether the people next to you were blanket hogs. More commonly, you used your daytime clothes as nighttime insulation. That tunic you'd worked in all day, sweat-stained, grease-spattered, reeking of smoke, stayed on your body. You didn't undress for bed, because undressing meant losing the thin layer of trapped warmth in the fabric. Your wool hose stayed on your legs. If you had a hood or cap, it stayed on your head, because everyone understood that you lost tremendous heat through your skull. Some workers would wrap their heads in rags or strips of old fabric, creating makeshift insulated hoods that covered everything but their eyes. The concept of pyjamas or night clothes was purely aristocratic. You slept in your work uniform, and your work uniform had been selected for its practicality, around open flames and hot surfaces not for its warmth. Linen or wool tunics that ended at mid-thigh. Wool hose that tied to your brays, those medieval underwear shorts that nobody talks about but everyone wore. Maybe a leather apron if you were an assistant cook, though you'd likely remove that because it wouldn't provide any insulation and would just take up space. Everything you wore was chosen based on, will this catch fire, not, will this keep me alive at night? And here's a detail that shows up in probate records. Occasionally workers would stuff their clothing with whatever they could find before sleeping. Dried grass between layers of tunics. Sheep's wool, literally raw wool, unwashed. Still greasy, shoved into your hose or wrapped around your chest under your shirt. Some would create crude padding by tying fabric scraps around their limbs, building layers like improvised insulation. One 14th century monastic chronicle describes a cook who died and was found to have his garments filled with manner of grasses and woolen stuffs, such that his body appeared twice its natural size. That wasn't obesity, that was desperate insulation. The wooden platforms themselves were sometimes covered with anything that could create a barrier. Old leather scraps from the tannery, not pleasant smelling, but leather blocked wind. Worn-out canvas from repaired tents or grain wagon covers. Even animal hides, though these were valuable enough that they usually went to higher status workers. A sheepskin, even a scraggly one with patches of bare leather, was a treasure that could keep your back from direct contact with frozen wood. You'd fight for a sheepskin. People have fought for less. Here's where the medieval workday reveals its special kind of cruelty. You never get a full night's sleep. Never. The kitchen doesn't sleep, remember, which means someone is always working and that someone is rotating through a shift pattern that would make a modern labour board spontaneously combust with rage. You work 8 hours, you sleep 4, you work another 6, you sleep 3 more if you're lucky. The idea of sleeping from sunset to sunrise, what we'd call a normal night, is a fantasy reserved for people who don't have to keep fires burning and dough rising through the darkness. The shift system varied by castle and season, but the basic pattern was brutally consistent. 3 or 4 rotating crews, each responsible for different blocks of time. The evening crew worked from afternoon through midnight, handling dinner service, clean-up and preparation for the next day's breakfast. The night crew, and this was usually the smallest, most exhausted group, kept watch over fires, turned spits if meat was slow roasting, checked bread ovens, and responded to any middle-of-the-night demands from the household. The dawn crew started around 4 a.m., stoking fires back to full heat and beginning breakfast preparations. Then the cycle would rotate so you weren't permanently stuck on night duty, but you also never established any regular sleep rhythm. What this meant for the sleeping quarters was something both practical and kind of brilliant. The beds never got cold. Think about it. You finish your evening shift around midnight, stumble into the dormitory, and claim a spot on the sleeping platform that someone from the dawn crew just vacated 20 minutes ago to start their work. The straw is compressed exactly to body shape. The wooden platform still holds their warmth. You're essentially sleeping in someone else's thermal footprint and in a medieval winter that's pure gold. There was an unspoken etiquette around this. When your shift was about to start, you'd wake up usually because someone else was shaking you, or because your body had internalized the rhythm after months of routine and you'd slide out of your spot carefully, trying not to let too much cold air rush in under the shared blanket situation. The person claiming your spot would be waiting, literally hovering next to the platform, ready to drop into place the moment you vacated. The exchange took maybe 5 seconds. Any longer, and the warmth dissipated. Historians still argue whether this sleeping in shifts arrangement was intentional thermal management or just a side effect of operational necessity. but kitchen workers definitely understood what they had. There are fragments of household regulations from the 15th century that mention workers trading shifts specifically to access better sleeping spots, warmer locations that had just been vacated, or times when the dormitory was less crowded and you could spread out slightly. A spot on the platform that had been occupied continuously for the past 12 hours by 3 different sleepers in sequence was genuinely warmer than a spot that had been empty. But here's the psychological nightmare of it: you never experienced darkness and silence at the same time. When you were sleeping, other people were moving through the dormitory in various states of wakefulness, coming off shift, preparing for shift, getting up to piss in the communal bucket, stealing a bit of someone else's blanket. Noise was constant. Snoring, coughing, the rustle of straw, whispered conversations, someone always stubbing their toe on the platform edge and cursing. And light leaked in constantly from the kitchen, the glow of banked fires visible through gaps around the door or torches in the corridor outside if someone needed to navigate at night. Your body adapted, sort of. Medieval people had different sleep architecture than we do. Without artificial lighting, their circadian rhythms were dramatically different. But even accounting for that, kitchen workers were chronically sleep-deprived in a way that would be considered torture by modern standards. 4 hours here, 3 hours there, maybe a longer stretch on your designated rest day, which came every 7 to 10 days, not weekly because medieval labour law was a suggestion at best. The segmented sleep pattern that was normal for medieval people, first sleep as wake for an hour or 2 around midnight, then second sleep until dawn, got completely scrambled for kitchen workers. You might get your first sleep during what was actually midday, then wake to work an evening shift, then grab your second sleep in the pre-dawn hours. Your body never knew what time it was, just that it was always either working or desperately trying to recover. And here's something that shows up in monastic infirmary records and occasionally in coroner's reports. Workers would sometimes sleep through their wake-up calls because their exhaustion was so profound. Not oversleeping by 20 minutes, sleeping through multiple people, shaking them, shouting at them, even pouring cold water on them. The body would just refuse to surface. This was dangerous because missing your shift could mean punishment, loss of food rations, or dismissal. But it was also dangerous because that level of exhaustion combined with extreme cold could slide into hypothermia without the person ever waking up. So the workers developed systems, sleeping in pairs where one person was responsible for waking the other, using the most reliable wakers, usually older workers who slept lightly as human alarm clocks. Some would drink extra liquid before sleeping so their bladder would wake them naturally. Others would position themselves near the door where cold drafts would keep them from sleeping too deeply. None of these methods were perfect, and the historical record is full of casual mentions of workers who failed to rise for their duty and faced consequences. The warm bed from the previous sleeper was one of the only comforts in this entire nightmare system. That and the fact that someone else would soon claim your warm spot, continuing the chain. You were part of a thermal relay race that never ended, passing body heat forward through time, like a secret message that said, "We're still alive, keep going." Now, let's address what you're actually wearing while you're trying not to freeze to death, because the medieval approach to sleepwear was essentially more of the same but damper. You're lying there in your work tunic, a knee-length or mid-thigh garment made of wool if you're fortunate, linen if you're not. And here's the thing about medieval kitchen work. Everything you wear is perpetually soaked, with some combination of sweat, steam, spilled liquids, and the general humidity that comes from boiling massive pots of water in an enclosed stone space for 16 hours a day. Wool, despite being damp, is still your best friend. Medieval people understood something that modern outdoor enthusiasts have rediscovered: wool retains warmth even when wet. The lanolin that natural grease from sheep creates tiny water-resistant pockets in the fibre structure, so your wool tunic, even dripping with the day's accumulation of kitchen moisture, is still trapping some body heat. It's clammy and uncomfortable and smells like wet dog mixed with wood smoke, but it's functional. Linen, by contrast, is absolutely useless when wet. It conducts heat away from your body like it's trying to kill you, which is why linen tunics were cheaper and why kitchen workers in linen often didn't survive their first winter. The layers matter intensely. You've got your brays, those linen undershorts that tie at the waist as your base layer, though calling them underwear makes them sound more substantial than they are. They're basically linen shorts that end at mid-thigh, and their main job is to protect your wool hose from direct contact with your skin, because wool is expensive and body oils destroy it over time. Then your hose wool stockings that cover each leg individually and tie to your brays with wool strings called points. These hose are knitted or cut from woven fabric, and they're the most critical piece of your survival gear. Your legs contain major blood vessels close to the surface, and if those get too cold, your whole body temperature plummets. Over that goes your tunic, and over that might go a second tunic if you own one. The wealthy had wardrobes. You have 2 tunics maximum, one you're wearing, one you're washing or have already worn to destruction, and are pretending you'll repair someday. Some workers would layer 3 or 4 tunics if they could beg, borrow, or steal extras, creating a kind of fabric cage of trapped air around their torso. You look bulky and ridiculous, but you're warmer than the person in a single layer, so who's really winning? Then there's the grease situation, and this is both practical and disgusting. Kitchen workers were constantly splattered with animal fats, rendered lard from pork tallow, from beef and mutton goose fat butter that had gone rancid. This grease soaked into fabric and never fully came out no matter how much washing happened, and washing was rare because it damaged the wool fibres, and you couldn't afford to replace your clothes. So your tunic became essentially waterproofed by layers of accumulated animal fat. This created a kind of waxy barrier that blocked wind and retained heat. It also meant you smelled like you'd been rolled in bacon grease and left in the sun, but everyone else smelled the same, so it was a collective understanding. Some workers deliberately rubbed extra fat into their clothing before sleep. Tallow, especially the hard fat rendered from cattle or sheep, could be worked into wool like a primitive wax coating. You'd take a chunk of tallow, warm it slightly in your hands, and rub it into the areas that needed the most protection: shoulders, chest, the small of your back. The tallow would stiffen the fabric slightly and create a wind barrier that could mean the difference between shivering and sleeping. This practice shows up in household accounts occasionally, where kitchen tallow wastage is noted. Some of that wasn't waste. It was workers taking small amounts for personal insulation. Your head covering was non-negotiable. Everyone slept with something on their heads because everyone understood that an uncovered head in a cold room was a fast track to illness. Coifs, those close-fitting linen caps that tied under the chin, were standard day wear for kitchen workers, keeping hair out of food and providing some protection from sparks. At night, the coif stayed on sometimes with additional wrappings. Strips of wool fabric wound around the head and neck like a primitive balaclava. Hoods pulled up and cinched tight. Some workers would even wrap their faces, leaving just their nose and mouth exposed because facial skin against frozen air was painful. Historians still argue about whether people removed their shoes or boots for sleeping, and the evidence suggests it varied wildly. Wooden clogs, the standard kitchen footwear, because they didn't absorb liquids, and could be hosed down, were probably removed because sleeping in rigid wooden shoes is brutally uncomfortable. But if you had leather shoes or boots, you kept them on. Partly for warmth, partly because leaving them unattended meant they'd be gone by morning, and partly because leather shoes took so long to dry that if you removed them while they were wet, you'd never get them back on your swollen feet in the morning. Foot wraps, strips of wool or linen wound around the feet inside shoes stayed on too. These got disgusting, quickly compressing into damp felted tubes that bred fungal infections and trench foot conditions, but they were essential. Your feet were your employment. Lose your feet to frostbite or infection, and you lost your position, and losing your position meant starvation or begging. So you kept those foot wraps on, you slept in your shoes if you had any, and you prayed your toes would still have feeling in the morning. And here's a detail that's both sad and ingenious. Workers would stuff additional fabric into their clothing before sleeping, creating improvised insulation. Extra rags shoved up your sleeves, a spare apron folded and tucked against your chest under your tunic. Some would even stuff their hose with straw or dried grass, though this was uncomfortable, and you'd wake up with your legs scratched to hell. But discomfort wasn't the priority, survival was. You could tolerate itching, you couldn't tolerate freezing. And now we arrive at one of the most genuine survival partnerships in medieval history, the dogs. Not as some cute side note, not as a fun fact about medieval life, but as a critical component of not freezing to death. Castle kitchen dogs were working animals, spitteners, vermin hunters, waste disposers, but at night they transformed into living, breathing, four-legged heating systems. And unlike the lord's hunting hounds or the lady's lapdogs, kitchen dogs weren't kennelled in some separate space. They slept where the kitchen workers slept because their labour didn't end when the fires were banked. Picture the typical kitchen dog, medium-sized, maybe 30 to 50 pounds, short-coated or wire-haired depending on breeding. These weren't purebreds. They were functional mutts selected over generations for their ability to work. During the day, the smaller dogs ran inside wheel mechanisms called turnspits, essentially hamster wheels connected to rotating spits, keeping meat rotating over fires for hours at a time. The larger dogs pulled small carts, carried loads, and most importantly kept rats and mice from overrunning the food stores. By nightfall, these dogs were as exhausted as the humans, and they needed sleep in the same cold spaces. What happened next was a transaction both species understood without negotiation: shared warmth. Dogs have higher body temperatures than humans, about 101 to 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit compared to our 98.6. They're also covered in fur that creates thousands of tiny air pockets that trap heat. A sleeping dog radiates warmth like a small furnace, and medieval kitchen workers knew this intimately. The dormitory sleeping platforms weren't just for humans, they were for the dogs too. And the dogs weren't sleeping to your feet like some romantic painting. They were pressed against your stomach, curled behind your knees, tucked against your back, sometimes literally draped across your chest. The practice was so common that it shows up in household regulations and ordinances. A 1423 rule from a Yorkshire castle specifies that no more than 2 dogs shall sleep upon the platforms with the workers, excepting in times of great frost when additional dogs may be permitted at the steward's discretion. That phrase, additional dogs may be permitted, tells you everything. This wasn't workers sneaking their pets into bed. This was official recognition that dogs were thermal survival equipment. There's a Middle English term that pops up occasionally in medieval texts: bedhound. Not a hunting hound, not a guard hound, a bedhound whose primary evening function was temperature regulation. Some of these dogs were specifically kept for this purpose, fed and maintained because their body heat was valuable. An older dog who could no longer run the spit wheel or chase rats might be kept alive purely because it still generated warmth, and the workers would riot if you took it away. The mutual benefit went both ways, obviously. Dogs in medieval castles faced the same cold that humans did, arguably worse since they had no control over fire or clothing. A dog sleeping alone in the kitchen would survive probably because dogs are remarkably hardy. But a dog sleeping pressed against a human body had a dramatically easier night. Your body heat warmed them, their fur insulated you, and together you created a microclimate that is survivable where either alone would have struggled. Historians still argue about the health implications, and they're right to, because medieval understanding of disease transmission was approximately zero. Sleeping with animals meant sleeping with fleas, mites, ticks, and whatever intestinal parasites the dogs carried. It meant dog breath in your face, dog fur in your mouth, and the occasional dog with digestive issues creating problems in the night. But here's the medieval calculation: you might get sick from the dog. You would definitely freeze without it. Easy choice. The dogs had preferences and workers knew them. Some dogs slept hot, these were the valuable ones, the ones workers would compete for. A dog that slept deeply and radiated heat like a coal stove was a prize. Other dogs were restless, shifting position constantly, and while they still provided warmth, they'd wake you repeatedly through the night. The best sleeping arrangement was one reliable dog positioned along your core stomach or back, and if you were lucky, a second dog behind your knees, because the backs of your knees had major blood vessels close to the surface, and keeping those warm had systemic effects. Children and elderly workers got dog priority. Another one of those unspoken rules that governed dormitory life. A 10-year-old turnspit who'd worked all day and weighed maybe 60 pounds couldn't generate enough body heat to survive a hard frost alone. Put a 30-pound dog against that child's stomach, and suddenly their survival odds improved dramatically. Same with the older workers whose metabolisms had slowed, whose bodies no longer regulated temperature efficiently. A dog could be the difference between waking up and not waking up. There's a 14th century French chronicle that mentions kitchen workers mourning a dog that died, not because they loved it, though they might have, but because they feared the winter without it. That sentence hits differently when you understand what it meant. They weren't being sentimental. They were being realistic about survival odds. Lose a good bed dog in October, and you had 5 months of winter ahead without that thermal buffer. And here's something that'll either warm your heart or break it: the dogs knew. They understood the arrangement. Kitchen dogs would voluntarily return to the dormitory at night, would climb onto the sleeping platforms without prompting, would position themselves against human bodies and settle in. Some of this was learned behavior. Definitely puppies raised in the kitchen learned from older dogs where to sleep and why. But some of it seems to have been deeper than that, a recognition that this was partnership, not servitude. You fed the dog warmed you. Fair trade. Let's talk about the other survival strategy that medieval kitchen workers deployed with religious fervour: drinking themselves into a state of internal warmth before attempting sleep. And I don't mean getting drunk for fun, though. That was certainly a side benefit. I mean the deliberate medically endorsed practice of consuming alcohol as a thermal management system. Medieval medicine had some genuinely insane ideas about how the human body worked, but they accidentally stumbled onto something. That modern physiology recognizes alcohol creates a sensation of warmth that, while ultimately counterproductive to actual heat retention, could get you through the psychological barrier of lying down in a freezing room. The standard pre-sleep beverage was ale, and not the craft IPA you're thinking of. Medieval ale was weak, cloudy, slightly sour, and consumed at room temperature, which in winter meant approximately the temperature of a basement refrigerator. It was safer than water, because the brewing process killed pathogens and it provided calories which your body could convert to heat. every castle kitchen worker received a daily ale ration as part of their compensation, usually a gallon or more per day, which sounds like alcoholism, until you realise it was maybe 2-3% alcohol, closer to modern kombucha than beer. But the ale for drinking during the day was different from the ale you wanted before sleep. For that you wanted something that had been warmed ideally with additions that medieval medicine believed enhanced its heating properties. This is where we get into the wonderful world of possets and caudles, hot drinks made from ale or wine mixed with various ingredients. A basic bedtime posset might be ale heated with honey, and a beaten egg creating something like a hot alcoholic custard that you'd drink from a shared wooden bowl. The honey provided sugar calories, the egg added protein and fat, and the warmth itself was the point. Wealthier households or kitchens serving wealthy households, which is a crucial distinction, might have access to spiced wine drinks. Mulled wine with cinnamon, cloves, ginger and pepper was reserved for the aristocracy, but kitchen workers sometimes got the dregs, the last inch of wine at the bottom of the serving jugs that would otherwise be wasted. This would be reheated, maybe diluted with ale or water, and shared among the evening shift as they prepared for sleep. These spices were believed to have heating properties according to medieval humoral theory, and honesty capsaicin from pepper dews create a warming sensation even if it's not actually raising your core temperature. Medieval medical theory held that the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and that these needed to be kept in balance. Cold was associated with an excess of phlegm and needed to be countered with hot foods and drinks. Alcohol was categorized as hot and dry, making it theoretically perfect for combating the cold, wet conditions of winter. Whether this was scientifically accurate is completely beside the point. What mattered was that people believed it, and belief has its own physiological effects. Historians still argue about how much of this drinking was medicinal versus recreational, but the evidence suggests both. A small amount of alcohol does create vasodilation. Your blood vessels expand, bringing warm blood to your skin, creating that flush of warmth you feel. This is actually dangerous in extreme cold because it increases heat loss from your body's core, but in the context of sleeping in a crowded dormitory, surrounded by other bodies, that initial warmth might be enough to let you relax and fall asleep before hypothermia became an issue. There's also the psychological component, and this matters more than you might think. Facing another night in a freezing stone room when you're already exhausted and you know you'll be awakened in 3 or 4 hours for another shift that's mentally crushing. A cup of warm ale with honey, shared with the people you're about to sleep pressed against, creates a moment of comfort and ritual. It's not just thermal, it's emotional. The warmth in your stomach, the slight buzz from the alcohol, the sweetness of honey. These are signals to your nervous system that you're being cared for, that there's still pleasure in the world even if it's microscopic. Some workers created their own variations with whatever they could access. Ale heated with crushed garlic was popular partly because garlic was believed to ward off illness, and partly because it was available in castle kitchens. The resulting drink was probably horrific by modern standards. Warm garlicky beer, but it was hot liquid going into your body, and that counted for everything. Others would mix ale with breadcrumbs, creating a kind of liquid porridge that was drink and food, simultaneously maximizing caloric intake before sleep. And here's a practice that shows up in monastic records and probably applied to secular kitchens. Communal drinking before sleep was ritualized. Not rowdy or celebratory, but quiet and almost ceremonial. The evening shift would gather around whatever heat source was available, usually a small brazier, or the embers of a banked kitchen fire, and pass around a shared cup or bowl. Each person would take a drink, maybe mutter a prayer or blessing, and pass it to the next person. This wasn't just about the drink, it was about acknowledging that you were all in this together, that you'd all survive the night or none of you would. The alcohol also served a darker purpose. It helped some workers sleep through the cold. Not comfortable sleep, but the heavy immobile sleep of someone whose body has been chemically depressed enough to stop registering discomfort. For the most exhausted workers, for those who couldn't mentally handle another night of shivering consciousness, a bit of extra ale might mean the difference between rest and psychological breakdown. It's a grim calculus, but medieval survival was built on grim calculus. Now we need to talk about the politics of sleeping position, because in a room where everyone is freezing and space is limited, and body heat is currency, where you sleep isn't random, it's a complex negotiation of status, vulnerability and survival odds. The sleeping platforms ran along 3 walls, remember, and not all positions on those platforms were equal. Some spots were objectively worse than others, and the distribution of those spots revealed everything about medieval social hierarchy, compressed into a 20 by 30 foot room. The worst positions were the end spots, the places where the platform met the exterior wall. These walls were stone, often 3 to 6 feet thick, and they were thermal sinks that absorbed heat from anything touching them. Sleep with your back against that wall, and you'd wake with cold so deep in your muscles it felt like your spine had been replaced with iron. These end positions also caught the worst of the drafts. Air would leak through gaps in the stonework through the mortar that had cracked over decades, and it would pour directly onto whoever was unfortunate enough to be positioned there. Who slept in the end positions? The youngest, strongest workers, the ones most recently hired, the ones with the least seniority, the ones whose bodies were deemed capable of taking the punishment. A 16-year-old scullion, who'd been working in the kitchen for 3 months, wasn't getting a protected middle spot. He was getting the corner position where the north wall met the west wall, and he'd spend the night shivering while conserving your energy, because complaining would get him dismissed. Medieval labour was abundant and individual workers were disposable. You either toughened up or you didn't survive your first winter. The middle positions were premium real estate surrounded on both sides by other bodies, insulated from the worst drafts benefiting from the collective heat of the group. These spots went to workers with seniority, to those who'd proven themselves valuable enough that the household wanted to keep them alive. A baker who'd been with the family for 15 years and knew exactly how the Lord liked his morning bread wasn't sleeping on the end. He was in the middle, protected with newer workers forming a thermal buffer around him. Children got middle positions too, but for different reasons. A 10-year-old turnspit didn't have seniority, but they had vulnerability, and even medieval economics recognized that dead children couldn't work. Children were tucked into the center of sleeping groups, surrounded by adults sometimes with specific workers assigned to keep an eye on them through the night. This wasn't pure altruism. Training a new child worker took time and resources, and if you let your current crop freeze to death, you'd have to start over with fresh recruits. Protecting children was an investment in future labour. Elderly workers occupied a strange position in this hierarchy. On one hand, their bodies couldn't generate heat as efficiently as younger workers, making them vulnerable. On the other hand, if they'd survived to elderly age in a medieval kitchen, which meant maybe their mid-40s or early 50s, they were probably valuable enough that the household wanted them protected. These older workers often slept in pairs with a younger worker, assigned to share body heat with them. Sometimes this was voluntary, an apprentice sleeping next to the master who was teaching them. Sometimes it was mandated, the steward designating someone to keep the head baker alive through winter, because finding a replacement would be expensive. Historians still argue about whether there was an actual formalized system or just emergent behavior, but household records suggest both. Some castles had written sleeping assignments, with positions on the platforms designated by role and seniority. Others left it to the workers to sort out themselves, which inevitably led to the same hierarchies, emerging through social pressure and occasional violence. If you were new and tried to claim a middle spot, you'd be physically removed, not brutally but firmly. Everyone understood the rules. The spots closest to the door were interesting. They were cold because of drafts, but they also had strategic value. You could get in and out without climbing over other bodies, which mattered if you needed to piss in the middle of the night, or if you were on an early shift and needed to leave before everyone else woke. Some workers preferred door-adjacent positions despite the cold, because the alternative, trying to extract yourself from the middle of a sleeping pile of humans at 4 a.m. without waking everyone and earning their hatred, was worse than just being colder. Women, in the rare cases where they worked in castle kitchens and slept in these dormitories, occupied specific sections, usually one end of one platform separated from the men by nothing more than understood boundary. This wasn't for modesty in any modern sense. Medieval people had very different concepts of personal space and bodily privacy. It was more about preventing the kind of nighttime accidents that happened when exhausted men and women slept pressed together in darkness. The separation was minimal, and the protection it offered was mostly theoretical, but households maintained it because the alternative was dealing with pregnancies, accusations, and violence that disrupted operations. There were also the workers who slept on the floor, not because there wasn't room on the platforms, but because they'd been relegated there as punishment, or because they were so low status that even the end positions were above them. Temporary workers, day labourers brought in for feast preparations, workers who'd committed some infraction. These people got floor space if they got anything. The floor was packed earth or stone colder than the wooden platforms by a significant margin, and sleeping there meant you were on your own for warmth, unless you could huddle with others in the same situation. And then there was the reality that positions shifted through the night. Bodies moved in sleep, people rolled over the person next to you, got up to piss, and someone else claimed their spot, and you'd wake to find yourself in a completely different configuration than when you'd fallen asleep. The sleeping platform was a slow-motion wrestling match, where everyone was trying to stay in the warm zones and avoid the cold ones, all while unconscious. By morning, the neat arrangement that had started the night had dissolved into whatever chaotic tangle had emerged through hours of unconscious negotiation. Now let's talk about something that's going to sound completely alien to your modern sleep experience. Medieval people didn't sleep through the night. Not because they were interrupted by external forces, though, that happened too, but because their natural sleep pattern was fundamentally different from ours. This wasn't insomnia or a disorder. It was the normal human sleep architecture before artificial lighting rewired our brains. And for kitchen workers, this segmented sleep pattern intersected with their brutal work schedules in ways that were both adaptive and absolutely exhausting. The pattern was called biphasic or segmented sleep, and it shows up in hundreds of historical documents, medical texts, prayer books, and personal diaries from the medieval period. People would have their first sleep for 3 or 4 hours after dark, then wake naturally around midnight for an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, then return to second sleep until dawn. This wasn't considered unusual or problematic, it was just how sleep worked. The period between first and second sleep even had names in various languages: the watching time in English, the dorveil in French. What did people do during this midnight waking period? In aristocratic households, they prayed, had sex, visited neighbours, read by candlelight, or simply lay in bed thinking. For kitchen workers, the midnight waking period was both stranger and more practical. You'd wake around midnight in that freezing dormitory, your body having naturally surfaced from first sleep, and you'd lie there in the darkness, listening to the breathing of 30 other people, the occasional snore, the scratch of rats in the walls, the distant sound of wind outside. Some workers use this time to check on their bodies. Were their feet still warm? Could they feel their fingers? Did anything hurt in a way that suggested frostbite or illness? This was practical medical self-assessment in an era when healthcare meant don't die and become someone else's problem. Others would adjust their positions, trying to wedge closer to a warm body, or reposition a dog that had migrated away during first sleep. The hour between sleeps was maintenance time for your survival apparatus. Prayer was common during this period, even among workers who weren't particularly devout during waking hours. There's something about lying in darkness surrounded by cold stone that makes you religious, even if it's just the superstitious kind of religion that amounts to, please let me survive until spring. Workers would mutter familiar prayers, the Paternoster Ave Maria fragments of Psalms, partly because they believed it helped, and partly because the rhythmic recitation was calming. The words became a kind of meditation that eased the transition back into second sleep. Historians still argue about whether this segmented sleep pattern was purely natural or partly enforced by environmental factors, specifically the cold and discomfort that might have prevented continuous sleep. The truth is probably both. Human circadian rhythms in the absence of artificial light do tend toward this biphasic pattern, but sleeping in a freezing stone room definitely made it more pronounced. You weren't just waking naturally, you were waking because your body was cold and uncomfortable and needed you to adjust something. For kitchen workers specifically, this midnight waking period intersected weirdly with their shift rotations. Remember, the kitchen never slept, there was always a night crew working, so during your hour of wakefulness between first and second sleep you could hear the kitchen operating beyond the wall. The clank of pots, the scrape of a poker against embers, occasional voices calling instructions. You were lying in darkness while your colleagues worked, and in a few hours or days you'd be on that shift while they slept. Some workers would actually get up during this period and visit the kitchen not to work, but to warm themselves briefly. If you were on good terms with the night crew, they might let you stand by the hearth for a few minutes, thawing your core temperature before returning to bed for second sleep. This was technically against regulations in most households. The night crew wasn't supposed to entertain visitors, but everyone understood the math of survival. A few minutes of warmth could mean the difference between sleeping through second sleep or shivering through it in miserable semi-consciousness. The midnight period was also when bladders made their demands known. The dormitory had a communal piss bucket, usually near the door downwind if there was any airflow, and the walk from your sleeping spot to that bucket in the middle of the night was an experience in pure misery. The air temperature dropped even further after midnight, and leaving your sleeping pile meant losing all the warmth you'd accumulated. Some workers would hold it, risking bladder infections. Others would piss in place, creating dampness that would freeze by morning. Most would make the walk quickly, cursing under their breath. There's a medieval medical text, the Regimen Sanitatis from the 11th century, that specifically discusses sleep patterns and recommends that workers in cold conditions should rise between sleeps to move the limbs and restore the heat to the extremities. This was practical advice based on observation. Staying completely immobile in extreme cold could lead to frostbite in fingers and toes. The midnight waking period was an opportunity to flex your feet, wiggle your fingers, ensure that blood was still flowing to your extremities. And here's something that shows up in fragmentary accounts and letters. The midnight waking period was sometimes the only private time kitchen workers had. During the day, you were under constant supervision, always visible, always accountable. At night, during first sleep, you were unconscious. But during that hour of wakefulness between sleeps in the darkness, you could think your own thoughts without anyone monitoring you. You could remember your family if you had one somewhere else. You could plan an escape if you were desperate enough. You could cry quietly if you needed to, knowing the ambient noise of 30 sleeping people would cover the sound. The transition back into second sleep was its own skill. Some workers could drop off easily, their bodies trained by months or years of this pattern. Others would lie awake for extended periods, their minds racing with anxiety about the coming day, with physical discomfort, with the existential dread that comes from being cold and poor and trapped. Those who couldn't return to second sleep would face their next shift, already exhausted, and exhaustion compounded night after night, until you either adapted or broke. Now we need to talk about the children, because medieval castle kitchens employed a significant number of child workers, and I'm not talking about teenagers, I'm talking about kids as young as 6 or 7 years old. These weren't cherished childhood years filled with play and education. These were children working adult hours in brutal conditions, and the question of how they survived winter nights requires understanding both medieval economics and the strange protective instincts that emerged even in the most hierarchical survival-focused environments. Child workers in castle kitchens fell into several categories. Turnspits, the kids who literally ran inside those wheel mechanisms to rotate meat over fires, were often between 7 and 12 years old. Scullions who scrubbed pots, hauled water and did the grunt work nobody else wanted ranged from 8 to 14. Some were servants' children born into the household. Others were essentially indentured, their parents having made arrangements with the castle steward to provide labour in exchange for the child being fed and housed. And some were orphans or foundlings who'd been absorbed into the household because free labour was free labour, even if it came in a £40 package that tired easily. The physiology of children in cold environments is genuinely different from adults, and medieval people understood this even without modern medical knowledge. Children have larger surface area to volume ratios, which means they lose heat faster than adults. Their bodies burn more calories relative to their size trying to maintain core temperature. A child exposed to the same cold as an adult will develop hypothermia faster. Put a 7-year-old in a freezing dormitory, and they're in immediate danger even if the adults around them are merely miserable. So the sleeping arrangements for children were given actual priority, and this is one of the few areas where medieval kitchen hierarchies bent towards something resembling compassion. Children were never put on the end positions, never. They were tucked into the middle of sleeping groups surrounded by larger bodies that acted as windbreaks and heat sources. The standard arrangement was to sandwich a child between 2 adults, creating a human microclimate, where the child benefited from body heat from both sides. Historians still argue about whether this was pure pragmatism, dead children couldn't work, so keeping them alive was economic necessity, or whether there was genuine protective instinct at play. The evidence suggests both. Household accounts show that child workers had slightly higher survival rates through winter than you'd expect given their vulnerability, which implies systematic protection. But there are also fragmentary letters and chronicles that mention workers specifically looking after the little ones, suggesting emotional attachment beyond mere economic calculation. Some children were assigned sleeping partners, usually an older worker, who was explicitly responsible for that child's survival through the night. This shows up in household regulations occasionally. The boy Thomas to sleep beside John Baker, who shall ensure the child's warmth. This wasn't just about sleeping position. It meant John Baker was supposed to check on Thomas during the night, make sure he hadn't kicked off whatever covering they had, ensure he was still breathing come morning. If Thomas died, John would face questions about whether he'd fulfilled his duty. The children also got dog priority, remember. If there were 2 good bed dogs available and only 1 adult versus 1 child needing them, the child got the dog. This was enforced by social pressure, if not explicit rule. An adult who took a warm dog away from a shivering child would face the collective hostility of the entire dormitory. Not because medieval people were sentimental, but because everyone recognized that children were more fragile, and the group's survival depended on maintaining certain minimal standards of collective care. But here's the brutal reality: children still died. The historical record is frustratingly vague about child mortality rates among kitchen workers, partly because record-keeping was poor, and partly because no one in authority particularly cared, but we have enough fragments to know it happened regularly. Coroner's reports occasionally mention children found frozen in the morning, usually with language like, "the boy having perished in the night of natural causes," natural causes meaning cold exhaustion and a body too small to fight both. The children who did survive developed adaptations. Their bodies learned to sleep in positions that conserved maximum heat, curled into tight balls, arms tucked inside tunics, knees drawn up to chest. They learned to stay absolutely still through the night because movement meant losing heat. They learned to press against adult bodies without shame or hesitation because survival outweighed any developing sense of personal space. And they learned to wake during the midnight period and assess their situation still warm enough, extremities still responding, need to shift position before second sleep. There's a heartbreaking detail in a 14th century household account book that lists extra small tunics purchased for winter issue to child workers. These were oversized garments intentionally made too large, so children could curl up inside them completely, pulling their arms inside the sleeves, drawing their legs up inside the body of the tunic, creating a fabric cocoon. The image of a child essentially hibernating inside an oversized wool tunic, while surrounded by sleeping adults and dogs, is both practical and deeply sad. Some of the older children, those 12 to 14, occupied an interesting middle space. They were old enough to work full shifts and handle significant responsibility, but still young enough to need protection. These teenagers often formed their own sleeping clusters, groups of 4 or 5 adolescents who'd huddle together, not integrated into the adult sleeping arrangements, but not isolated either. They'd position themselves near adult groups close enough to benefit from some shared warmth, but maintaining their own territory. It was almost like watching young animals learning pack behavior. The children also received slight preference in the pre-sleep drinking ritual. That warm ale with honey we talked about. Children got theirs with extra honey if it was available because the sugar provided concentrated calories their bodies needed. Some households provided children with heated milk instead of ale, rare and expensive, but recognition that growing bodies needed different nutrition. This wasn't universal by any means, but it shows up enough in accounts to suggest it was practiced in wealthier or better managed households. And here's something that appears in monastic chronicles and probably applied to secular kitchens: the protective instinct toward children intensified during the worst weather. During January cold snaps or blizzard conditions, when even adults were genuinely scared, the children would be brought into even tighter sleeping formations. Adults who normally wouldn't sacrifice their sleeping position would reorganize to create maximum protection for the youngest workers. It was as if some ancient human survival programming kicked in: protect the young when the threat becomes existential. So what was actually happening in the kitchen while you were lying in that freezing dormitory, suspended between first and second sleep, listening to the muffled sounds of activity beyond the wall? Because the midnight kitchen was its own strange world, a realm of half-light and skeletal crews, where the normal daytime chaos compressed into something quieter but no less essential. And understanding what happened there helps explain why the sleeping arrangements were structured the way they were. why certain workers were exempt from night duty, and why the night crew was simultaneously the most exhausted and sometimes the most valued workers in the hierarchy. The night shift was typically 3 to 5 people in a castle kitchen that might employ 30 during the day. Their job wasn't to prepare elaborate meals, it was maintenance and surveillance. The fires had to be kept alive but banked down to conserve fuel. This meant periodic checks every hour or two, adding small amounts of wood or coal, adjusting airflow, ensuring the embers stayed hot enough to be quickly revived come morning. Letting a kitchen fire die completely was a fireable offence sometimes. Literally you'd lose your position, because rekindling from scratch could take hours and delay breakfast service for the entire household. Bread dough was the other major midnight responsibility. Medieval bread production operated on long fermentation schedules because they were working with natural yeast cultures, wild yeasts captured from the air or maintained in perpetual starter cultures. Dough would be mixed in the late evening and left to rise overnight in wooden troughs positioned near the residual heat of banked fires. The night crew had to monitor this rising, checking that the temperature stayed consistent, that the dough didn't overproof or collapse. Around 3 or 4 a.m. they'd begin shaping loaves and preparing the bread ovens for the dawn baking session. Then there were the stock pots, those massive cauldrons that simmered perpetually with bone broths, meat stocks, and the base liquids for soups and stews. These couldn't be allowed to boil dry, couldn't be left unattended for extended periods. The night crew would check them, add water if needed, adjust their position relative to the coals. Some of these stocks had been simmering for days, building layer upon layer of flavour, and losing one because nobody checked it at 2 a.m. would be catastrophic for the next day's meals. Meat preservation happened at night too. If the household had slaughtered animals during the day, certain cuts needed to be salted, packed, or hung immediately. The night crew handled this, rubbing salt into flesh-packing cuts into barrels, hanging carcasses in the cold storage areas. This work was done at night, partly because it was time-consuming, and the day crew was too busy with meal service, but also because nighttime temperatures were colder, reducing the risk of spoilage before preservation methods took effect. Historians still argue about whether night duty was punishment or privilege, and the answer seems to be both depending on perspective. It was punishment in the sense that working through the night while everyone else slept was exhausting, isolating, and meant you'd be sleeping during daytime hours when the dormitory was noisier and less comfortable. But it was privilege in that you had relative autonomy, no head cook standing over you, no steward checking your work every 15 minutes. You could work at your own pace, and if you wanted to warm yourself by the hearth for an extra few minutes, there was nobody around to forbid it. The night kitchen had an eerie quality that shows up in the few descriptions we have. The vaulted ceilings disappeared into darkness that even rushlights and tallow candles couldn't fully penetrate. Shadows moved strangely as flames flickered. The sounds were different without the daytime chaos of chopping, shouting pots, clanging you could hear the building itself. Stone settling timbers, creaking wind finding gaps in the walls. Rats were bolder at night, emerging from hiding spots to investigate food scraps. The night crew learned to work with ambient rat activity, occasionally kicking at them, but mostly just coexisting. There's a psychological component to night duty that medieval people understood but didn't have language to describe. Working alone or in tiny groups through the dark hours does something to your brain. Time dilates, your thoughts turn strange. You become hyper-aware of sounds and movements in ways that feel almost supernatural. The night crew would sometimes report seeing things, shadows that moved, wrong sounds that had no source, cold spots in the kitchen that shouldn't exist. Whether these were genuine paranormal experiences or just exhausted brains hallucinating is beside the point. The night kitchen felt haunted, and workers believed it was haunted, and that belief shaped their experience. Food theft was easier at night, and the night crew had opportunities that day workers didn't. A piece of bread from the rising dough, a cup of the perpetual stock, a bit of cheese from the larder, these were perks that came with night duty. Not officially sanctioned, but tolerated because everyone understood that night workers needed compensation beyond their regular rations. Some of what was consumed during night shifts was logged as wastage or spoilage. In household accounts, deliberate misfiling that protected both the workers and the steward who allowed it. The relationship between night workers and sleeping workers was complex. The night crew would sometimes warm items by the fire, extra tunics, strips of fabric, even stones, and bring them to the dormitory during their breaks, distributing warmth to sleeping colleagues. This wasn't required, but it created social capital. Help someone survive a brutal night, and they'd remember when you needed help during your day shift. The night crew also served as informal guardians of the sleeping dormitory, checking that the door was secured, that no one was in medical distress, that children hadn't somehow gotten uncovered and were at risk. And here's a detail that shows up in monastic records the night crew would sometimes sing. Not loudly quiet songs, work songs, prayers set to melody. The sound would carry softly through the kitchen and into the adjacent dormitory, and sleeping workers would hear it in their dreams or during their midnight waking period. It was a signal we're working, everything is functioning, you're safe to sleep. The songs were practical communication, but also comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest, coldest hours, the household continued to operate, the fires stayed lit, and dawn would eventually come. Now we need to confront the thing that's been hovering at the edges of this entire story. Sometimes people didn't wake up. Not because they overslept their shift, not because someone forgot to shake them, but because their bodies had simply run out of warmth during the night and slipped from sleep into hypothermia, into death. This wasn't common enough to be expected, but it was common enough that it had procedures. Medieval household accounts, coroners' reports and monastic chronicles contain scattered references to workers found cold in the morning, and the language is always disturbingly matter-of-fact, as if this was just another administrative detail to be managed. The physiology of freezing to death is insidious because it doesn't feel like dying, at least not at first. Your body temperature drops and you feel cold, obviously. You shiver violently as your muscles try to generate heat. But then if the cold continues and you can't warm up, something strange happens, the shivering stops. Your body is conserving energy, shutting down non-essential functions. You feel almost warm, even peaceful. Your thinking gets confused. You make poor decisions like removing clothing or wandering away from your sleeping spot. This is called paradoxical undressing, and it killed people who might have survived if they'd just stayed still. In a medieval dormitory full of sleeping people, someone dying of hypothermia might not be noticed until morning. They'd stop shivering, good, they must have warmed up. They'd stop moving, good, they're sleeping peacefully. The people pressed against them might not realize that the body next to theirs was getting colder, rather than warmer, because the temperature change was gradual, and their own exhausted bodies weren't registering the difference. By the time dawn arrived and someone tried to wake them for their shift, they'd been dead for hours, their bodies stiff with rigor mortis, sometimes with frost in their hair and eyebrows. The demographic most at risk was predictable. The newly arrived workers who hadn't yet adapted to the cold, the elderly whose bodies no longer regulated temperature efficiently, the sick or injured whose metabolisms were already compromised, and occasionally the alcoholics who'd drunk too much and passed out in a state where their bodies couldn't fight the cold. Children should have been high risk too, but remember they were systematically protected. Most of the freezing deaths were young adults in their first winter, or older workers in their final one. Historians still argue about the actual mortality rates because medieval record-keeping was inconsistent and biased toward people who mattered. A scullion who froze to death might get a single line in a household account. John Scullion died position filled by Peter. A valued baker's death would generate more documentation, possibly a coroner's inquest if the death seemed suspicious. Definitely records of hiring and training a replacement. But the overall impression from the fragments that survive is that 1 or 2 workers dying during winter was not unusual for a large castle household, and some of those deaths were cold-related. The morning discovery had its own protocol. Whoever found the body would check for life pulse breath. Any warmth remaining, though by the time someone was checking it was usually obvious. They'd notify the steward or whoever was managing the kitchen that day. The body would be removed from the dormitory, because leaving a corpse around living workers was both impractical and bad for morale. There'd be a brief investigation mostly to determine if the death was natural or if someone might be responsible. Did the worker have enemies? Was there evidence of violence? Could this be blamed on negligence by the person who was supposed to be monitoring them? Most cold deaths were ruled natural causes because honestly, what else could they be? The person was sleeping in the designated area following household rules, and their body simply couldn't generate enough heat to survive the night. No crime, no negligence, just the brutal mathematics of human metabolism versus medieval architecture. The body would be wrapped in whatever cheap cloth was available and buried quickly, usually in the castle or parish cemetery, with minimal ceremony. Funeral expenses came from the workers' wages if they had any saved or from a general household fund if they didn't. The psychological impact on the other workers was complex. On one hand, death was so much more present in medieval life that one more corpse wasn't shocking in the way it would be to modern people. Everyone had seen death, most had lost family members, and the idea that life was fragile and could end suddenly was just baseline reality. But on the other hand, watching someone you'd slept next to, whose body heat had warmed you the night before, get carried out stiff and frozen, created a specific kind of dread. That could be you. It might be you tomorrow night if the temperature dropped another few degrees. Some workers would refuse to sleep in the spot where someone had died, superstitious belief mixing with genuine trauma. The dead person's position on the sleeping platform would stay empty for a night or two, until space pressure forced someone to claim it. Others would deliberately take that spot, a kind of fatalistic bravado. If death is coming anyway, might as well not be afraid of it. The dead worker's possessions, usually just a spare tunic, maybe a bowl, occasionally a small amount of saved money, would be distributed among the other workers, or claimed by whoever found them first. There's a detail in a 15th century French household chronicle that mentions workers performing small rituals after someone froze to death. They'd heat stones by the kitchen fire and place them in the dormitory overnight, a symbolic gesture of trying to warm the space that had killed their colleague. They'd share an extra round of warm ale, each person drinking to the memory of the deceased. These weren't official ceremonies or religious rites, just small human gestures of acknowledgement that someone who'd been alive yesterday was gone today, and the cold was responsible. And here's the darkest part: the household would replace the dead worker within days, sometimes immediately. There was no mourning period for kitchen staff. The work had to continue, meals had to be prepared, and a dead scullion represented a labour gap that needed filling. A new worker would arrive, often someone who had no idea their predecessor had frozen to death in the spot they were about to inherit, and the cycle would continue. The dormitory would be just as cold, the sleeping arrangements just as brutal, and the new worker would face the same odds of survival with the same minimal resources. But here's where medieval survival instinct turned creative, because humans are remarkably good at not dying when the alternative is unacceptable. Kitchen workers developed improvised strategies that weren't officially sanctioned, weren't in any household manual, but were passed down through whispered advice and desperate experimentation. These were the survival hacks that existed in the gap between what the household provided and what you actually needed to make it through January. The bread ovens became sleeping spots for the truly desperate. After the evening baking was finished, usually around 8 or 9 p.m., these massive stone or brick ovens would retain heat for hours. The interior temperature would drop from cremate a human body to merely very warm by midnight. Some workers, particularly those who were sick or elderly, or who'd been assigned the worst sleeping positions, would negotiate with the night crew to spend an hour or two inside a cooling bread oven. You'd climb into the baking chamber large enough to hold multiple loaves so large enough for a curled-up human, and absorb heat directly from the stone walls that had been storing thermal energy all day. This was absolutely against regulations. The fire risk was real. Residual embers could reignite, and having a human body inside an oven complicated that danger. There was also the indignity of it, the reduction of a person to something that would share space with bread. But regulations matter less than survival, and if the night crew liked you or owed you favours, they'd look the other way for an hour. You'd emerge warm for the first time in days. Your skin flushed, your core temperature actually elevated to something approaching normal. That warmth might last through the night if you immediately bundled into the sleeping pile, or it might dissipate in an hour, but either way it was something. Grain storage areas were another secret sleeping location. Castle larders often contained large bins or rooms filled with loose grain wheat, barley, rye stored in bulk. Grain in mass generates its own slight warmth through respiration and slow fermentation, and it provides insulation when you bury yourself in it. Some workers would sneak into these storage areas and literally burrow into the grain piles, covering themselves completely except for their face. The grain would conform to your body shape, eliminating air pockets, and the collective mass would trap your body heat. You'd emerge in the morning covered in grain dust and chaff, looking like you'd been breaded for frying, but you'd be alive. This practice shows up occasionally in household accounts as grain wastage or unexplained grain compression, which is administrative language for someone has been sleeping in the food stores and we're pretending not to notice. The steward knew, the head of household probably knew, but investigating meant confronting the fact that your workers were so cold they were burrowing into raw grain like desperate animals, and that reflected poorly on household management. Easier to just note the wastage and move on. Historians still argue about the health implications grain storage attracted rodents, and sleeping in rodent-infested grain is a good way to catch diseases. But again, medieval calculations, possible disease versus certain freezing, the workers who used this strategy were typically the most desperate, those who'd been assigned sleeping positions that were genuinely life-threatening, or who were sick and needed extra warmth to fight off illness, or who were new and didn't yet have the social capital to secure better dormitory positions. Hanging meat in the larders provided another improvised solution. During winter, large cuts of meat, entire pig carcasses, sides of beef, haunches of venison would be hung in cold storage areas to preserve them. These rooms were cold by design, but less cold than the exterior air, and the hanging meat created a kind of forest of protein that blocked wind and provided psychological comfort if nothing else. Some workers would find spaces between hanging carcasses and huddle there, using the meat as windbreaks. The image is macabre, sleeping in a room full of dead animals surrounded by the smell of blood and fat, but meat doesn't judge you, and meat blocks drafts. There's a household record from a 14th century English castle that mentions workers being punished for disturbing the meat stores during night hours, which is probably code for sleeping where the dead pigs hang. The punishment was typically loss of a day's rations or reassignment to worse duties, not dismissal, suggesting the authorities understood why it was happening even if they couldn't officially condone it. Some workers would heat stones or bricks by the kitchen fire during their evening shift, then smuggle them into the dormitory wrapped in rags or tucked inside their clothing. A heated stone could stay warm for hours, and if you positioned it against your core stomach or lower back, it could keep your vital organs warm even if your extremities were freezing. This required planning and cooperation with whoever was working the evening shift, and it meant carrying a heavy hot object without getting caught by supervisors who might confiscate it on principle. The stone warming strategy shows up in monastic records more than secular household accounts, possibly because monks were more literate and documented their practices more thoroughly. A 13th century chronicle from a Benedictine monastery describes brothers heating stones and distributing them to the elderly and infirm before completing the final prayer service before bed. The practice likely extended to monastery kitchens, and from there to secular households, spreading through the network of workers who moved between positions carrying their survival knowledge with them. Clothing theft was another improvised strategy, though calling it theft is maybe too harsh. It was more like clothing redistribution based on need. If someone had 2 tunics, and you had none, and they weren't watching carefully, their extra tunic might become your only tunic. If someone died and their wool hose were in better condition than yours, well, the dead don't need warm feet. This wasn't malicious, it was practical. The household provided minimal clothing and supplementing that through unauthorized acquisition was how you survived. There were also the workers who would sleep in shifts with partners, not because the shift system required it, but as a deliberate survival strategy. 2 people would share a single sleeping position, taking turns being awake. One would sleep while the other stayed conscious, monitoring their partner's breathing, adjusting coverings, ensuring they didn't slip into hypothermia. Then they'd switch the waker, becoming the sleeper. Neither got a full night's rest, but both had a guardian watching over them, and that surveillance could mean the difference between waking up and not. And here's a strategy that sounds insane but was documented. Some workers would exercise immediately before sleep, doing just enough physical activity to elevate their heart rate and body temperature. Jumping in place, running through the dormitory, vigorous arm movements, anything to generate heat through muscle activity. They'd work themselves into a light sweat, then immediately burrow into the sleeping pile while their bodies were still hot. The elevated temperature would fade, but it might fade slowly enough to let them fall asleep before the cold became unbearable. Now let's talk about the master cook's privilege, because we've been focused on the masses of workers huddled in freezing dormitories, but medieval kitchens had hierarchies, and those hierarchies came with thermal benefits. The head cook, the master who ran the entire operation, who planned menus and managed staff and answered directly to the household steward, didn't sleep in the communal dormitory with the scullions and turnspits. They had better accommodations, and understanding what better meant reveals both the privileges of rank and the limitations of medieval comfort, even for those at the top of the kitchen hierarchy. The master cook typically had a private chamber, though calling it private is generous. It was usually a small room, maybe 8 by 10 feet, adjacent to the kitchen or above it if the castle architecture allowed. Stone walls, low ceiling, possibly one narrow window that could be shuttered against wind. The critical difference was that it was individual space not shared with 30 other bodies. You could close a door. You could have possessions without them being stolen. You could sleep without someone else's elbow in your ribs or their foot in your face. But here's what that private chamber often didn't have: a fireplace. Fireplaces were architectural features reserved for the nobility and highest-ranking household officers. A kitchen master cook was important, but not important enough to warrant the expense and construction complexity of a personal fireplace. So their private chamber was private, and cold, arguably colder, than the communal dormitory, because they didn't have the benefit of 30 other humans generating collective warmth. The privilege of privacy came with the cost of isolation from the thermal mass of other bodies. Some master cooks were provided with braziers, small metal containers that held burning coals. These could be brought into a chamber for temporary heating, though they were dangerous in enclosed spaces because of carbon monoxide risk. Medieval people understood that burning coals in sealed rooms could kill you. They called it suffocation by vapours, without understanding the chemistry, so braziers were used cautiously. You'd heat your chamber for an hour before sleep, then remove the brazier or let it burn out before lying down. The residual warmth might last a few hours if you were lucky. Historians still argue about whether master cooks actually used their private chambers during the worst winter months, or if they strategically abandoned them to sleep closer to kitchen warmth. The evidence is mixed. Some household accounts show master cooks requisitioning extra firewood or charcoal for personal chambers, suggesting they are trying to heat those spaces. Others show master cooks maintaining sleeping spots in warmer areas despite having chambers available, suggesting the chambers were more about status and storage than practical sleeping locations. The master cook's bedding was superior, an actual bed frame rather than a platform, possibly with a rope or leather strapping to support a thicker straw mattress. They might have wool blankets, plural, rather than sharing fractions of communal blankets. Some had fur coverlets. Rabbit cat, occasionally sheepskin if they'd been with the household long enough to receive such gifts, or had saved enough to purchase them. These are the kinds of possessions that show up in probate inventories when master cooks died, and they're revealing, because even at this elevated status level we're talking about modest comfort by modern standards. The master cook also had priority access to warming foods and drinks. They could authorize their own posset of heated wine with expensive spices before bed without asking permission. They could take hot stones from the kitchen fire without negotiating with the night crew. They could theoretically warm their chamber more effectively because they had the authority to redirect household resources toward their personal comfort. Whether they actually did this is interesting. Some clearly did, but others maintained solidarity with their workers, refusing to take advantages that would breed resentment. That resentment was real and documented. A 14th century household chronicle mentions kitchen workers complaining about their master sleeping in comparative luxury while they froze in the dormitory. The complaint reached the household lord, who investigated and found that the master cook's luxury consisted of a private room with no heating, a thin straw mattress and 2 blankets. The lord's response, roughly translated, was, "That's the privilege of rank, deal with it." But the fact that workers felt comfortable complaining suggests the perceived gap between master and worker comfort was significant, even if the objective reality was that both were miserably cold. Some master cooks managed to position themselves in rooms above the kitchen, taking advantage of rising heat. This was brilliant when it worked. The kitchen fires would warm the floor of your chamber from below, creating passive heating without requiring a fireplace or brazier. But it only worked if the kitchen architecture included habitable space directly above the cooking areas, and many castles didn't have this. Kitchens were often separate buildings or in basement areas specifically to contain fire risk and smoke-making overhead chambers impossible. The master cook's age factored into their survival odds significantly. Younger masters, those in their 30s or early 40s who'd risen quickly through skill or connections, could tolerate the cold better, and sometimes chose to maintain closer connection with their workers sleeping in warmer communal areas, despite having private chambers available. Older masters, those in their 50s or beyond, which was genuinely elderly, for medieval labourers needed whatever advantages their rank provided. Their bodies couldn't generate heat as efficiently, and sleeping alone in a cold chamber could be fatal without adequate preparation. There's a detail in household accounts that appears periodically master cooks being permitted additional firewood for personal use during hard frost. This permission was exceptional, granted only when temperatures became life-threatening, and it reveals that normally they didn't have such allowances. The household was carefully managing fuel resources, and even the master cook, the person responsible for feeding sometimes hundreds of people daily, wasn't automatically entitled to enough firewood to heat their chamber through winter. When temperatures dropped to genuinely dangerous levels, the steward would authorize extra fuel, acknowledging that losing your master cook to hypothermia was an operational disaster worth preventing through resource expenditure. And here's the final complexity: some master cooks used their private chambers primarily for storage and status while actually sleeping elsewhere. They'd maintain the appearance of using their privileged accommodation while secretly sleeping in the warmer scullery area or in the kitchen itself after it was officially closed. This way they kept their status the visible sign of rank that mattered in medieval hierarchies while making practical survival decisions. The private chamber was for storing valuable possessions for occasional privacy when they needed to change clothes or count inventory, but not necessarily for sleeping through winter nights. The privilege of being master cook was real, but it was a relative privilege in an absolutely brutal system. You had advantages the scullions didn't have. You also still lived in a world where comfort meant maybe you won't freeze to death tonight if you plan carefully. Now let's compare this nightmare to what was happening in monastic kitchens, because medieval monasteries and abbeys also had to feed communities, and the kitchen workers also had to survive winter nights. The question that historians love to argue about is whether religious houses treated their workers more humanely than secular castles, and the answer is complicated enough to deserve its own exploration. Spoiler monks weren't necessarily kinder, but their organizational structure created some genuine advantages alongside new problems. Monastic life operated on the rule, most commonly the rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century and refined over centuries. This rule governed everything from prayer schedules to food allocation to sleeping arrangements, and it included specific provisions about care of the sick, the elderly, and those performing manual labor. In theory, this meant kitchen workers in monasteries had protections that secular workers didn't. In practice, it meant there was at least written acknowledgement that keeping workers alive through winter was a moral and operational necessity. The big structural difference was communal dormitories, and I don't mean the kind we've been discussing where kitchen workers were shoved into leftover space. Monastic dormitories were purpose-built, designed into the abbey layout from the beginning. They were still cold, absolutely, because heating large stone buildings was impossible. But they were architecturally considered rather than improvised. Higher ceilings meant better air circulation. Positioning relative to the church and refectory meant some passive heat transfer. Small details, but they mattered. Monastic kitchens also operated on different labour logic. Many were staffed by the monks themselves on rotating duty rather than by permanent servants or serfs. A brother might work kitchen duty for 3 months, then rotate to manuscript copying or farm labour or prayer duties. This meant the people suffering in the kitchen were the same people making administrative decisions about the community, which created incentive to maintain minimally humane conditions. If you know you'll be on kitchen duty next winter, you're motivated to ensure the sleeping arrangements don't kill people. But here's where it gets complicated. Not all monastic kitchen workers were monks. Larger abbeys employed lay workers, people from surrounding villages who worked for wages or food rations, and these workers occupied the same precarious position as their secular counterparts. They slept in separate dormitories, often in worse conditions than the monks, and they had no voice in community decisions. So the humanitarian benefits of monastic organization applied primarily to brothers, in the order not to everyone working in the kitchen. Historians still argue about whether monastic food rations were more generous. The evidence suggests slightly, but not dramatically. The rule of Benedict specified that each monk should receive a hemina of wine daily and adequate bread and cooked vegetables. Wine and beer rations for lay workers are less consistently documented, but monastic account books suggest they received similar but slightly reduced amounts. The critical difference was reliability. Monastic communities were generally better organized and less subject to the whims of individual lords, so rations arrived more consistently even in hard times. The monastic infirmary system was a genuine advantage. Abbeys maintained infirmaries, dedicated spaces for sick and injured members of the community, with actual beds, sometimes heating and medical care that was primitive by modern standards but advanced for medieval contexts. A kitchen worker in a secular castle who got sick would continue working until they collapsed, or would be dismissed if they couldn't work. A kitchen worker in a monastery who showed signs of illness, fever, persistent cough, frostbite symptoms, might actually be moved to the infirmary and given rest time to recover. Might, if the infirmarian deemed them sick enough, and if there was space. But the possibility existed. Monastic sleeping arrangements still involve the same packed dormitory approach we've been describing, but with some systematic protections. The rules specified that the elderly and infirm should have their beds positioned away from draughts, that adequate bedding should be provided, and that a lamp should be kept burning in the dormitory through the night, partly for safety, partly to discourage sin, but practically providing a tiny amount of warmth and psychological comfort. These provisions weren't always followed, but they existed as written standards that could be appealed to. Here's a fascinating detail from a 12th century Cistercian customary: kitchen workers were permitted to warm themselves by the calefactory, a heated room that most monasteries maintained for communal warming. This room had a fireplace and was open at specified hours for monks to thaw out. In secular castles, equivalent warming rooms existed but were restricted to nobility and high-ranking household members. Allowing kitchen workers access to the calefactory even for limited periods represented genuine recognition of their thermal needs. But monastic life also imposed hardships that secular workers didn't face. The rule mandated specific sleep and wake times coordinated with prayer schedules. Night office prayers sung at 2 or 3 a.m. meant everyone was waking in the coldest part of the night to go to the church, which was often the coldest building in the entire complex. Kitchen workers on monastic duty had to participate in these services, which meant less continuous sleep and exposure to extreme cold in the middle of the night. Secular workers could at least stay bundled in their sleeping piles unless they were on night shift. Monastic silence rules created another strange effect. Many monasteries enforced periods of silence, including nighttime hours, when speaking was forbidden except in emergency. This meant the dormitory was quieter than secular equivalents. No whispered conversations, no midnight commiseration, no verbal checking that everyone was okay. Communication happened through gestures and touch, and while monks developed elaborate sign languages for practical purposes, the inability to verbally comfort each other in the darkness had psychological weight. There's evidence that some monastic communities were genuinely more protective of their kitchen workers. A 13th century chronicle from a Benedictine abbey describes the abbot personally checking the kitchen dormitory during hard frosts, ensuring adequate bedding was distributed and authorizing extra food rations for workers showing signs of cold exhaustion. Compare that to secular household accounts where the Lord probably never visited the kitchen dormitory and had no direct knowledge of conditions there. But there's also evidence of monastic communities being brutally indifferent, particularly toward lay workers. A coroner's inquest from 1340s England investigated the death of a kitchen servant at a priory who perished of cold in the night. The investigation revealed he'd been sleeping in an unheated outbuilding separate from the monks' dormitory with minimal bedding, and had frozen during a particularly harsh cold snap. The priory was found to have violated no rules because technically lay servants weren't covered by the same provisions as monks. The death was ruled accidental and no one faced consequences. Spring didn't arrive like a gentle sunrise, it came as a brutal inventory of who'd survived and who hadn't. When the first genuine warmth arrived, usually late March or early April, castle stewards would conduct what household accounts euphemistically called assessments of winter losses. This wasn't just counting dead bodies, though that was part of it, but evaluating the overall damage winter had inflicted on the workforce, who were still functional, who had developed chronic illnesses that would limit their effectiveness, who needed to be replaced, and most pragmatically, how quickly could the household return to full operational capacity? The spring thaw revealed things that had been hidden or ignored during winter's worst months. Workers who'd been functioning on pure survival adrenaline would suddenly collapse once the immediate threat passed their bodies, finally admitting they'd been pushed beyond sustainable limits. Infections that had been suppressed by cold would flare up in warmer temperatures. Frostbite damage that had seemed manageable in February would turn gangrenous in April, requiring amputation or leading to death. The steward's assessment wasn't just about counting survivors, it was about determining who among the survivors was actually usable. The physical toll showed up in predictable patterns. Respiratory illnesses were endemic. Months of breathing cold, damp air in smoke-filled environments destroyed lung tissue. Chronic coughs, bloody sputum, difficulty breathing under exertion. These were the signatures of workers who'd survived winter but had sacrificed long-term health to do so. Some would recover with rest and better nutrition as spring vegetables became available. Others would carry the damage permanently, their working years cut short by scarred lungs that never fully healed. Frostbite casualties were assessed with brutal practicality. Lost toes weren't necessarily disqualifying. You could still work in a kitchen with fewer toes, though your balance suffered and you tired more easily. Lost fingers were more serious because kitchen work required manual dexterity. A cook who'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite might be demoted to roles requiring less precise handwork, or dismissed entirely if the household deemed them insufficiently productive. The calculus was pure economics. Could this damaged person still generate value that exceeded the cost of their rations? Historians still argue about actual mortality rates because the documentation is so fragmentary and biased. Household accounts might note 3 scullions replaced in spring without specifying whether they died, were dismissed for incompetence, or simply left for other employment. Coroners' reports only covered deaths that seemed potentially criminal, not natural deaths from cold or illness. Parish burial records sometimes help you can track spikes in servant deaths during winter months, but linking specific deaths to specific households is often impossible. What we can say is that staff turnover in spring was significant and expected. A large castle kitchen might employ 30 to 40 workers through winter, and it wasn't unusual to replace a quarter of them by May. Some of those departures were death. Some were workers who'd been so damaged by winter that they could no longer perform adequately. Some were workers who quit the moment weather allowed travel-seeking employment literally anywhere else. because one winter in that kitchen was enough for a lifetime. The replacement process was systematic and somewhat grim. Stewards would begin recruiting in late winter, anticipating spring losses. They'd send word to surrounding villages, to other households, to markets and fairs that positions would be available. Young people looking for employment displaced workers from failed harvests. People desperate enough to take whatever was offered, they'd arrive in spring not knowing they were replacing corpses and invalids. The continuity of the institution mattered more than the individual bodies staffing it. Spring also meant clearing out the dormitory, literal physical cleaning that had been impossible during winter. The accumulated straw and rushes, compressed and fouled by months of use, would be raked out and burned. The platforms would be scrubbed, though scrubbed meant scraped with rough tools, more than any modern conception of cleaning. The smell would be incredible months of human habitation, sweat illness, and death, all releasing at once as the space was opened up and aired out. New straw would be brought in, and the cycle would begin again. Personal possessions of the dead or departed would be distributed or discarded. Any clothing or tools that had value would be claimed by survivors or sold by the steward to recoup minor costs. Items with no clear value, worn-out shoes, broken bowls, scraps of fabric too damaged to be useful would be thrown out. Sometimes these clearances revealed hidden things, small amounts of saved money sewn into hems, stolen items tucked under platforms' letters, or tokens that hinted at lives beyond the kitchen. Most of this would be confiscated or destroyed, the administrative system erasing traces of people who'd ceased to be economically useful. There's a detail in a 15th century English household account that's darkly poetic. Expenditures for spring replacement of kitchen staff, including recruitment fees, travel costs for new workers, and burial costs for those lost in winter. The burial costs are listed alongside recruitment fees as if death and replacement were simply two sides of the same administrative coin, which from the household's perspective they were. The system required X number of workers to function. Some would die obtaining that number, others would arrive to fill the gaps. The machine continued operating regardless of the individual suffering within it. Some households maintained records of worker performance and reliability, and these would be consulted during spring assessments. A worker who'd survived winter and maintained good output despite brutal conditions might receive recognition, perhaps slightly better, sleeping assignments next winter, perhaps a small increase in rations, perhaps just verbal acknowledgement of their value. These were the workers the household wanted to retain, the ones who'd proven they could endure. Others who'd survived but were deemed weak or troublesome would be let go. The spring assessment was an opportunity to shed workers who'd been barely functional, who'd required too much supervision, who'd caused social problems in the dormitory. The household wanted efficient, resilient workers, and spring was when you could be selective. Labour was more available in spring, people could travel, farms were hiring for planting season, alternatives existed. Winter hiring was desperate, spring hiring was strategic. And here's what happened to the workers who'd been damaged beyond usefulness. Some returned to families, if they had any. Some ended up begging in towns or at monastery gates. Some simply disappeared from the historical record, their fates unknown and unconsidered. Medieval social support systems were thin to non-existent. If you couldn't work, your survival depended on charity, family connections, or luck. A kitchen worker who'd lost fingers to frostbite or developed chronic respiratory illness had few options and bleak prospects. The spring thaw was also when you discover that some people had been barely hanging on through winter, and now with safety in sight simply gave up. There are accounts of workers who seemed fine through March but collapsed in early April, as if their bodies had been running on pure willpower and finally allowed themselves to break once survival was no longer minute by minute. The psychological toll of sustained survival stress is something medieval people understood experientially, even if they couldn't articulate it in modern psychological terms. Now let's wade into the stranger waters of medieval folk remedies and superstitions surrounding winter survival. Because kitchen workers didn't just rely on wool blankets and shared body heat, they deployed an entire arsenal of beliefs, rituals, and practices that range from genuinely helpful to completely insane. And here's the fascinating thing: sometimes it's impossible to separate the two, because even practices that seem purely superstitious could have psychological or placebo effects that genuinely improved survival odds. Garlic shows up everywhere in medieval cold weather survival lore, and for kitchen workers who had easy access to it, garlic became a kind of universal protective substance. Workers would eat raw garlic before sleep, believing it warmed the blood and prevented illness. They'd rub garlic on their feet and wrap them in cloth, a practice that supposedly improved circulation. Some would hang braided garlic near their sleeping spots to ward off cold spirits, or the night vapours that were believed to carry disease. Modern medicine recognizes that garlic has mild antimicrobial and circulatory properties, so workers stumbling on something useful while believing it for completely wrong reasons. The practice of wearing garlic around the neck, yes, like vampire protection, wasn't about vampires at all in medieval contexts. It was about respiratory illness. The strong smell was believed to keep bad air away from your nose and mouth. And in a dormitory full of people breathing on each other all night, anything that might reduce disease transmission had value. Whether garlic actually helped, or whether the psychological comfort of having protection mattered more than the physical effect, is impossible to untangle at this distance. Prayer and blessing rituals before sleep were nearly universal, blending Christian orthodoxy with older folk practices in ways that would have made church authorities uncomfortable if they'd looked too closely. Workers would make the sign of the cross over their sleeping spot, recite specific prayers for protection from cold and death, and sometimes sprinkle holy water if they could get it on their bedding. The Lord's Prayer was standard, but there were also quasi-magical elaborations that sound more like spells, prayers invoking specific saints, known for protection, rhythmic repetitions that had more to do with psychological comfort than theology. Saint Agatha was particularly popular among kitchen workers because she was the patron saint of protection from fire, but also through medieval logic leap from its opposite extreme cold. Workers would pray to her before sleep, sometimes keeping small tokens or images of her if they could afford them. Whether Agatha actually interceded is theological debate, but the ritual of prayer created a psychological moment of preparation, a transition from the chaos of work to the stillness of attempted sleep. Historians still argue about the prevalence of older pre-Christian practices that survived in folk traditions. There are references in church disciplinary records to workers performing rituals that sound suspiciously pagan, making offerings to hearth spirits, reciting charms that invoked natural forces rather than Christian saints, wearing amulets that had nothing to do with approved religious iconography. These practices were officially forbidden but persisted because, from the workers' perspective, survival required every possible advantage whether the church approved or not. Red thread tied around the wrist was a common protective practice with murky origins. It shows up in various medieval contexts as protection against different threats: disease, evil spirits, bad luck, and for kitchen workers it was specifically protection against freezing. The logic varied red was the colour of blood and fire, so it symbolically kept warmth in the body. Or the thread itself was blessed by a priest or wise woman and carried literal protective power, or it was pure superstition that persisted because people who wore it survived and people who didn't sometimes died, creating confirmation bias that reinforced the practice. Tallow candles blessed on Candlemas, February 2nd, were believed to have special protective properties, and kitchen workers would try to obtain small pieces of these candles to keep near their sleeping spots. The candles were supposed to ward off death and darkness, and keeping one unlit near you was insurance against dying in the night. When someone did die, there'd often be discussion about whether they'd had their Candlemas candle, as if its absence explained the death in spiritually satisfying terms. There were also practices around building small shrines or protective spaces within the dormitory. A corner might accumulate a collection of objects. A rough wooden cross, some dried herbs, rosemary was popular. A worn prayer book if anyone could read a smooth stone from the river that supposedly had protective properties. These weren't official installations. They emerged organically as workers contributed items they believed had power. The shrine became a focal point for group ritual, a place where workers would briefly touch or pray before settling down to sleep. Animal fat rubbed into the skin, particularly the chest, feet, and hands, was both practical insulation and ritual protection. We've discussed the practical thermal benefits, but there was also belief that animal fat carried the essence of the animal's warmth and vitality. Goose fat was preferred when available because geese were associated with winter survival. They grew heavy with fat to survive migration. Pig fat was common because it was available, but it was considered less powerful. Bear fat was rare and expensive, but believed to be the most effective because bears survived winter through hibernation. Some workers would sleep with iron objects, a nail, a knife, a horseshoe tucked into their clothing or under their bedding. Iron was believed to repel malevolent spirits and bad luck, and in the medieval mind, extreme cold was associated with death and evil. Iron provided protection against these forces. From a modern perspective, this was pure superstition. From a medieval worker's perspective, every person they knew who'd frozen to death had lacked adequate protection, and iron might be the missing element. Breathing techniques and body positions were passed down as practical wisdom that had folk magical elements attached. Workers were advised to sleep curled in specific positions, knees drawn up, hands tucked into armpits, which actually does conserve heat by minimizing surface area. But the instructions often came with explanations about protecting your vital essence, or preventing your soul from escaping through various body orifices. The practice was sound, the reasoning was fantastical. There's a 14th century medical text, the Taquinum Sanitatis, that recommends workers in cold conditions should visualize fire while falling asleep, imagining their body as a hearth with internal flames. This is fascinating because it's almost like medieval guided meditation using mental imagery to create physiological effects. Whether visualization actually elevated body temperature is doubtful, but the relaxation and focus it provided might have helped workers fall asleep, despite cold and discomfort. And here's where it all gets beautifully complicated. Some of these practices genuinely helped, some were neutral, but psychologically comforting, and some were probably counterproductive but persisted anyway. Medieval people were conducting empirical experiments, trying things, seeing what happened, passing along what seemed to work. They just lack the scientific framework to understand why things worked or didn't. And finally we arrive at the hearth itself, the fire that never dies, the flame that's more than just combustion and heat, the symbolic and literal center of everything we've been discussing. Because medieval kitchen workers understood something that we've mostly forgotten. Fire wasn't just a tool or a convenience. Fire was life itself, the dividing line between survival and death, and the perpetual hearth flame represented continuity, protection, and the fragile persistence of human existence against a cold universe that wanted to extinguish you. The hearth was never allowed to die. This wasn't just practical efficiency, though rekindling a fire from scratch with flint and steel could take an hour and wasted valuable time. It was deeper than that, almost religious even in secular contexts. A household's hearth flame was considered the soul of the home, and letting it die was catastrophic bad luck, a kind of small death that predicted larger deaths to come. The night crew's most sacred duty wasn't cooking or cleaning, it was fire-keeping, ensuring that when dawn arrived the flame still lived. In many households the hearth fire was literally ancient flames that had been maintained for decades, sometimes generations. Wood or coal would be added, ash would be cleaned out, but the core ember was theoretically the same ember that had burned when the current lord's grandfather was a child. This continuity mattered intensely. The fire connected present workers to past workers, living people, to dead people, the current struggle to all the previous winters that had been survived. You weren't just tending a fire, you were maintaining a tradition that proved survival was possible because it had already happened. Kitchen workers developed personal relationships with the hearth that sound strange to modern ears, but made perfect sense in their context. They'd talk to the fire not as a figure of speech, but as actual conversation. Stay alive tonight. Keep us warm. Don't go out. These weren't prayers exactly. They were acknowledgements that the fire was a partner in survival, an entity with agency that needed to be respected and negotiated with. And here's the thing, fires do have a kind of agency. They grow, they weaken, they respond to feeding and neglect. The relationship wasn't entirely metaphorical. The colour and behaviour of flames carried meaning. A strong, steady flame with deep red coals was healthy and reliable. It would last through the night with minimal intervention. A weak flame that flickered or burned blue was dying in distress, demanding immediate attention. Workers learned to read fire the way sailors read the sea, understanding its moods and needs through observation. This knowledge was passed down through generations-old workers, teaching young ones the language of flame and ember. Ash itself was valued beyond its practical use as cleaning agent or insulation. Hearth ash was believed to carry protective properties, and workers would sometimes rub it on their skin before sleep, partly because it provided a tiny bit of insulation, partly because it was ritual protection. Ash from the hearth that had kept you alive was imbued with that same protective power. Some workers would keep small amounts of hearth ash in pouches worn around their necks, physical tokens of the fire that sustained them. The moment when coals were banked for the night was ritualized across different households, with variations on similar themes. The night crew would arrange the remaining coals, carefully covering them with ash, to slow combustion, positioning them to burn steadily through the dark hours. This wasn't just a mechanical process, it was performed with attention and care that bordered on ceremonial. Some workers would make the sign of the cross over the banked coals, others would recite specific phrases, "Rest well, return strong." The words varied, but the intent was universal, asking the fire to survive the night so humans could survive the night. Historians still argue about how much of this fire reverence was Christian overlay on older pagan practices, and the answer is probably completely blended to the point where separation is impossible. Fire worship is ancient and cross-cultural, and medieval Christianity absorbed it, rather than replacing it. The hearth became associated with the eternal flame of faith, with the Holy Spirit represented as flame at Pentecost, with light conquering darkness. But underneath the Christian language, the relationship between humans and fire was primal, and pre-religious. We need fire to live. Fire needs us to maintain it. Therefore we're bound together. The fire also witnessed everything. All the suffering, all the desperate survival, all the small human moments that happened in that kitchen, Over decades, the fire saw it all. When you worked your shift in front of that hearth, you were working in the presence of something that had been there for your predecessor and would be there for your successor. This created a strange continuity, a sense that your individual struggle was part of a larger pattern. You weren't alone in your suffering because the fire remembered everyone who'd come before you. The fire's failure was catastrophic not just practically but symbolically. If the hearth fire went out through negligence, through extreme conditions, through bad luck, it felt like death had entered the household. The process of rekindling was somber, almost funereal. The steward would be notified. There would be investigation into how it happened. The fire would be restarted, but it was a new fire, not a continuation of the old one. The symbolic connection to the past had been severed. Some workers believed that households never fully recovered from losing their ancestral hearth flame, that bad luck would follow. And here's where we close this long night's exploration. The relationship between sleeping workers and the distant hearth was the relationship between life and death held in temporary balance. You'd lie in your freezing dormitory surrounded by the breathing bodies of your fellow workers, with dogs pressed against you for warmth, wrapped in whatever fabric you'd managed to accumulate, and somewhere beyond the stone wall the fire was burning. You couldn't see it. You might not even be able to feel its warmth, but you knew it was there, and that knowledge mattered more than you could articulate. The fire was burning while you slept. The fire would still be burning when you woke. As long as the fire lived, you could live. The kitchen workers and the hearth flame were engaged in the same struggle, finding enough fuel to make it through the night, converting resources into heat, persisting against cold that wanted to extinguish everything warm and alive. You were fundamentally similar, just operating at different scales, both fragile, both stubborn, both refusing to go out. When you finally did fall asleep, exhausted, cold, surrounded by the sounds of 30 other people breathing with a dog's heartbeat pulsing against your ribs, your last conscious thought would often be of the fire, still burning, still alive, still there. The hearth was keeping watch while you surrendered to sleep, maintaining the thin edge of warmth that made survival possible. It was guardian companion and proof that something could persist through the darkness without being consumed by it. The fire does not speak, but it listens. The wind outside forgets your name, and the chamber for another night at least continues to breathe. Now let the final embers of this story settle into gentle darkness. You've walked with medieval kitchen workers through their coldest nights, felt the stone walls press their chill against your back shared sleeping space with dogs and strangers, and survived, at least in imagination, what so many endured in flesh. The truth is, we can never fully know what those nights felt like. We can study the documents, trace the architectural remains, analyze the historical fragments. But the lived experience of cold, that profound of exhaustion, that complete of survival, that precarious that exists beyond our comfortable modern comprehension, we've been too warm for too long to truly understand. But perhaps that's the gift this story offers, a reminder that human resilience isn't about thriving or conquering or achieving. Sometimes it's simply about lasting through the night, about sharing warmth with whoever's beside you, about keeping the fire alive because the alternative is unthinkable, about waking one more morning and continuing, not because you're winning, but because stopping means freezing. Those medieval kitchen workers, the scullions and turnspits, the bakers and cooks, the children pressed between sleeping adults, the elderly huddled near whatever warmth they could find, they weren't heroes. They were just people trying not to die. And most nights through, nothing more than stubborn persistence and shared body heat, and a fire that refused to go out they succeeded. The hearth flames that warmed them are long cold now. The dormitories are ruins or tourist sites. The people themselves are dust. But the fact of their survival, the simple profound fact that they made it through winter after winter, in conditions that should have killed them, that persists. It echoes forward through time, a quiet testament to what humans can endure when we must. So as you drift toward your own sleep tonight in your heated room under your warm blankets, with no one pressed against you unless you choose it with tomorrow's breakfast guaranteed, and next winter an abstraction that seems impossibly distant, maybe spare one thought for those who had none of these securities, who slept in the cold and woke in the cold, and knew that spring was months away but chose to continue anyway. The fire is still burning somewhere, metaphorically if not literally. And we're all still here, descendants of people who refused to freeze, who shared their warmth, who kept the flame alive through the longest nights. Rest well. The hearth keeps watch, and morning as always will come. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.